That morning started like any other weekday. I was standing in my kitchen, waiting for the coffee to finish dripping, looking out at the parking lot behind my apartment. It had rained overnight, and the pavement still held that damp gray shine. My phone rang just as I reached for my mug. It was the hospital. By the time I got to work, I had already heard the words twice, and they still didn't feel real. My father had passed early that morning. Heart failure. No warning. No long decline. Just a call, a pause, and then a sentence that changed the shape of the day. I walked into my manager's office with my bag still on my shoulder. She was at her desk, glasses low on her nose, answering emails with both hands moving fast across the keyboard. I said her name once, quietly, and she looked up for half a second. "My dad died this morning," I said. "I need a few days off. The funeral's in Kentucky, so I'll need 4 days to get there and back." She didn't say anything right away. She clicked on another message, read it, and then said, "You can take 2. I remember standing there with my hand still resting on the strap of my bag. The office heater was running too hard, and the air had that dry, recycled smell every corporate building seems to have. Somewhere out in the hallway, a copier started up. Everything kept moving like this was a normal conversation. "I'm driving," I said. "It's about 8 hours each way." She leaned back in her chair a little and finally looked at me, then attend the service virtually. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood her. I just stood there. My father had raised me alone from the time I was 11. There are some things you don't explain twice. "I'm not watching my father's funeral on a screen," I said. She let out a breath through her nose, like I was making a simple scheduling issue more difficult than it needed to be. "We're in the middle of the Belmere conversion," she said. "Everybody is expected to be here." I had worked there a little over 3 years. I had covered weekends, late nights, messy handoffs, skipped lunches, and more last-minute emergencies than I could count. I had built systems nobody seemed to notice until they stopped working. Still, I kept my voice even. "I've never asked for anything like this." She gave a small shrug. "This is work. We all make choices." I looked at her for another second, then nodded once. "Understood," I said. That was all. No argument. No raised voice. I turned and walked out. The hallway back to my desk looked different that afternoon. Same gray carpet. Same frame posters about initiative and culture. Same low hum from the lights. But once something breaks in your mind, familiar places can start to feel borrowed. I didn't go back to my desk right away. I kept walking past my row, past the break room with the burnt coffee smell, past the printer station, all the way to the side exit near the loading dock. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected. I sat in my car with both hands on the steering wheel and watched a delivery truck back into the alley behind the building. Then I waited, not because I was unsure, mostly because I knew the next decision needed to be made without anger. Late that night, I logged in from home. I had done remote work for that company at all hours before. Holidays, Sundays, bad weather days, quarter close weekends. This time, though, I wasn't opening client files or trying to save another deadline. I went to the folders I had built and maintained myself over the years. My own work, my own documentation, process maps, troubleshooting notes, clean reference sheets, corrected scripts, recovery steps, little private systems that kept larger systems from falling apart. Most of it existed because nobody had wanted to spend time building it properly. I had done it piece by piece, usually after everyone else signed off. I sat at my dining table with one lamp on and the rest of the apartment dark. The refrigerator made that soft clicking sound every few minutes. My coffee had gone cold. On the screen, folder names lined up in neat rows, plain and ordinary. But I knew what they were worth. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I found an old voicemail from my father that I had never deleted. It was nothing important. He was asking whether I still had his socket set and reminding me to rotate my tires before winter. His voice was steady, practical, like always. When it ended, the apartment felt even quieter. I put the phone face down. Then I made a list. Step 1. Separate what belonged to me from what belonged to the company. Step 2. Preserve anything personal, original, and clearly authored on my own time. Step 3. Leave nothing behind that I was not required to leave behind. No anger, just order. By sunrise, I had a single compressed archive on an external drive, a short resignation letter drafted, and one plain text note sitting where a certain internal guide used to be. I read the note twice. It was only one sentence. Then I heard my phone begin to vibrate across the table. I didn't pick it up. I let the phone ring until it stopped on its own. A minute later, it started again. Then again. I was still sitting at my kitchen table, the sky outside just beginning to lighten behind the apartment buildings across the lot. My laptop was open. My resignation letter was attached to a blank email. I could see my own reflection faintly in the screen. I read the letter one last time. It was short. No speech. No long explanation. Just a formal resignation, effective immediately, and a note that any future communication should be sent by email. I didn't thank them. I didn't accuse anyone either. I kept it plain and professional because plain language tends to travel farther than emotional language does. Then I sent it. A few seconds later, the first reply came in from my manager, Dana. The subject line still carried the original resignation header, but the body was only 2 lines asking me to call her as soon as possible. By then, my phone had started buzzing again across the table. I closed the laptop. At around 8 that morning, I was on the road heading south. I had a duffel bag in the back seat, a black jacket folded beside me, and a paper cup of gas station coffee in the console that tasted mostly like heat. The freeway out of the city was already filling with commuters, everybody moving with that same focused morning expression. I kept both hands on the wheel and let the traffic carry me forward. The farther I drove, the quieter I felt. My father lived outside Lexington in a small ranch house he'd owned for years. Brick front, narrow porch, 2 maples in the yard. He was the kind of man who tightened cabinet hinges before guests came over and sharpened old lawn tools instead of replacing them. He taught shop classes at the community college for most of his working life, and even after he retired, people still called him to ask how to fix things. He never liked fuss. He liked function. Somewhere past Cincinnati, my phone lit up on the passenger seat with another incoming call. This time it was not Dana. It was my department head, Robert. I let that one go too. When I stopped for gas, I checked my emails standing beside the pump. There were already 6 new messages. 2 from Dana, 3 from Robert, 1 from IT asking whether I had intentionally changed access on several internal materials. Their wording was careful. Mine would be too. I got back in the car, pulled onto the highway, and kept going. By the time I reached my father's house, the sun was lower and the shadows in the yard had started stretching long across the grass. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before getting out. His neighbor from 2 houses down, Mr. Talbot, was standing by his mailbox in a windbreaker, and when he saw me, he lifted a hand but didn't come over right away. I appreciated that. Inside, the house still smelled like coffee, cedar, and that clean, dusty warmth old homes get when the heat has been running. His reading glasses were on the end table beside the recliner. A folded newspaper sat on the kitchen counter with a pen resting across the crossword. Nothing in the house looked prepared for absence. I set my bag down in the hallway and just stood there for a minute. Then I started doing the simple things. I opened a window over the sink. I put the perishables in order. I rinsed out a mug. I found the funeral home paperwork on the table where the hospital staff had left it. Name, date, service time, burial details. Thin paper, crisp corners, clean black print. There is something about official paper that makes loss feel mechanical. I made another pot of coffee even though I didn't want any. That evening I went out to the garage. It looked exactly the way I remembered. Pegboard wall, hand tools in careful rows. A workbench with light scratches from years of actual use. A radio on the shelf above a drawer full of drill bits. The room smelled like sawdust, machine oil, and old metal. I turned on the overhead light and sat on the stool by the bench. There was a small wooden piece sitting off to the side under a folded rag. Walnut, partly shaped, not finished yet. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. It was smooth on one edge and rough on the other, like he had stopped mid-step and meant to come back later. I set it down exactly where I found it. Then my phone started vibrating again in my coat pocket. This time I looked. I had 17 missed calls. I also had a new email from Robert marked urgent. I opened it while sitting there in the garage with the bench light on and the rest of the room in shadow. He wrote that several client-facing processes were now unsupported because the accompanying reference material could not be located. He asked whether I had copies and whether I could help the team restore continuity during this difficult moment. That phrase stayed with me for a second. During this difficult moment. Not my difficult moment. Theirs. A few minutes later, Dana sent another message. Shorter, sharper. She stated that work created during my employment was considered company property and that immediate cooperation was expected. No condolence. No acknowledgement of why I had left in the first place. Just demand, framed in formal language. I read both emails twice. Then I opened my laptop on the workbench and started sorting what I had. I wasn't trying to outmaneuver anyone. I was trying to be exact. That matters more than people realize. Exact records make calm decisions possible. So I built a folder with timestamps. One folder held copies of messages I had sent over the last year warning about training gaps, outdated reporting logic, unsupported processes, and missing backup procedures. Another held draft proposals I had written asking for time to document systems properly. A third held screenshots of unanswered requests. Nothing dramatic, just a paper trail. Dates, subject lines, attachments, meeting notes. The kind of information most people ignore until they need it all at once. Around 9 that night, Robert emailed again. This time the tone had changed. He wrote that the Belmere migration was now experiencing delays and several people were trying to understand workflows that had apparently only existed in my documentation. Apparently. I leaned back on the stool and looked at the garage wall for a while. My father used to say that most problems get loud right around the time they become visible. He never said it like a lesson, just as a fact. I put the phone face down. Then I waited. The next morning I met with the funeral director, signed forms, picked a time for the service, and chose a casket my father would have considered too expensive no matter what I picked. The office had soft carpet and lemon cleaner in the air. A little lamp in the corner glowed amber against a shelf of brochures. The woman helping me spoke gently, slid documents across the desk one at a time, and gave each decision the amount of silence it needed. That mattered to me more than I expected. When I walked back out to my car, there were 3 new voicemails. One from Dana, one from Robert, one from someone in legal I had never spoken to directly before. I sat in the driver's seat and listened. Dana's message was clipped and impatient. She said the missing materials were now affecting deliverables and asked for an immediate return call. Robert's was more careful. He said they wanted to find a professional resolution. Legal left the shortest message of all. They requested that I preserve any company-related materials in my possession pending review. I remember staring through the windshield at the funeral home sign across the lot. White background, black letters, a flag moving a little in the breeze near the entrance. I could have called from there. I could have spent that afternoon explaining, defending, softening, answering. Instead, I started the car and drove back to the house. That afternoon, I sat at my father's kitchen table with the blinds half open and the late light striping the floor. I opened each voicemail again, not to hear the words, but to study the order. First demand, then concern, then procedure. That told me what I needed to know. So I made another list. Step 1. Keep every conversation in writing whenever possible. Step 2. Separate grief from business, because they would not do it for me. Step 3. Answer only when the terms were clear. By evening I sent one email to Robert, copying legal and Dana. I wrote that I was unavailable for any immediate calls due to family arrangements. I stated that I would consider a limited paid consulting arrangement if they needed assistance understanding processes I had personally developed. I also said any conversation would need to be scheduled in advance and confirmed in writing. Nothing emotional, nothing extra. I hit send, closed the laptop, and carried my coffee out to the back porch. The air had turned cold. Somewhere a dog barked twice and then stopped. The porch boards gave a little under my shoes. In the yard, the porch light threw a weak yellow shape across the grass. I sat in one of the old metal chairs and listened to the quiet. About 20 minutes later, my email chimed. It was Robert. He asked if I would be available for a meeting the following afternoon with him, Dana, and someone from legal. I read the message once. Then I looked out into the dark yard and let the screen go dim in my hand. I did not answer Robert's email right away. I set the phone down on the porch armrest and stayed there a little longer. The metal chair was cold through my shirt, and the night air had that clean, still feel you get in smaller towns after sunset. Across the yard, the maple branches moved just enough to make a soft, dry sound. Inside the house, the kitchen clock kept ticking. I had learned something over the years. Urgency feels very different depending on who owns it. The next morning, I was up early. I made coffee in my father's old drip machine, the one that rattled for a few seconds before it settled into a steady hiss. I stood at the counter while it brewed and watched the steam cloud the window over the sink. On the table beside me were the funeral home papers, a yellow legal pad, and my laptop. I read Robert's email again. Then I replied with one sentence. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern works. Send a calendar invite. That was it. No apology for the delay. No explanation. No attempt to soften the fact that I would speak when I decided to speak. A few minutes later, the invite came through. Robert had added Dana and someone named Melissa Trent from legal. The meeting title was Documentation Access Review. Even that told me something. They were trying to frame the problem before the conversation started. I accepted the invite and went back to the day in front of me. There were errands to handle, people to call, flowers to confirm, a suit to pull from the closet in the spare room. My father kept everything in labeled boxes and neat stacks, so even the hard tasks had a certain order to them. Insurance papers, bank envelopes, utility statements. His handwriting on the tabs, dark blue ink, square and steady. That afternoon, I spent an hour in the garage. I opened drawers. I sorted fasteners into small trays. I wiped dust from the bench lamp. On the shelf above the work table was an old shop notebook of his, one of many. I flipped through it standing there under the light. Measurements, material lists, cut notes, dates in the corner of every page. Nothing fancy, just a record of work done carefully. That settled me more than anything else. Back inside, I sat down with my own records and built a clean file for the meeting. I kept it simple. A copy of my resignation, a timeline of requests I had made for backup coverage and training support, email chains where I had documented process risks, messages where I had asked for time to formalize the materials everyone was now asking for, a short summary of what I had personally created outside the company's managed documentation library. No opinions, no adjectives, just dates, attachments, and sequence. Around 6 p.m., Dana sent another email. This one was shorter than the others. We need this resolved before the Belmere client review. No greeting, no signature beyond her name block. Just pressure, stripped down. I looked at it for a second and closed the laptop. Then I waited. The next day, I joined the call 1 minute early. I was sitting at my father's kitchen table with a mug beside me and the blinds half open. The afternoon light came in at an angle and laid bright lines across the wood grain. In the background, the refrigerator hummed softly. On the screen, my own camera image showed a plain wall and part of the cabinet behind me. Clean, neutral, nothing to explain. Robert joined first. He looked tired. His collar sat uneven under his sweater, and there were deep folds under his eyes like he had not slept well in a while. Dana joined a few seconds later. Her mouth was already set tight. Then Melissa from legal appeared in the third window, glasses on, expression unreadable, fingers moving across a keyboard just below frame. Robert spoke first. Before we begin, I want to say we're sorry for your loss. I nodded once. Thank you. He paused, maybe expecting more, but I had no interest in stretching the moment into something performative. He moved on. We're trying to understand what happened to several internal materials that are now unavailable to the team. I took a sip of coffee before I answered. The materials you're referring to were reference tools I created over time for my own use and, when necessary, shared informally to keep projects moving. Dana leaned forward. They were used in company operations. Some of them were, I said, because no formal replacement was ever approved. Melissa glanced down, typing. Robert folded his hands. What we need right now is access. Belmere is in active migration. There are client-facing dependencies, and the team can't fully reconstruct the process from what remains. I let that sit for a second. Then I said, I understand. That was all. Dana frowned, like the calm answer bothered her more than resistance would have. Then I assume you'll restore the files. No, I said. Nobody spoke for a moment. I could hear someone's keyboard on the other end of the call. A faint tapping, then silence. Melissa was the one who stepped in. Our position is that work product developed during your employment may fall under company ownership. That depends on what it is, I said, and when, where, and how it was created. Dana started to respond, but I kept going in the same tone. What I removed does not contain client data. It does not include source code from company systems. It is not a copy of licensed platform material. It is a personal knowledge base built from my own methods, notes, structures, and cross-references because I was repeatedly expected to support systems without staffing, without training support, and without protected time to document them properly. Robert rubbed a hand over his forehead. I continued. I also have a dated record of requests where I raised those issues and asked for official support. Those requests were not acted on. Melissa looked up then. Really looked up. Dana's expression changed slightly. Not softer, just more careful. Robert cleared his throat. So where does that leave us? That was the moment the conversation changed. Up to then, they were speaking as though I would eventually return to the position they had assigned me in their minds. Helpful former employee. Temporary inconvenience. Problem to be pushed back into place. I set my mug down and answered in steps. Step 1. I am not returning to my former role. I gave them a second to absorb that. Step 2. I am not reinstating removed materials into your systems. Dana opened her mouth, but I kept going. Step 3. If you need my expertise to explain processes I personally developed and maintained, I am willing to provide limited consulting support under a written agreement. The call went still. Robert blinked once. Dana leaned back very slowly. Melissa stopped typing. I went on in the same calm voice. My rate is $300 an hour, 20-hour minimum, paid in advance. Meetings scheduled around funeral and estate obligations. Questions submitted in writing whenever possible. Scope limited to process explanation, troubleshooting guidance, and transition support. Dana gave a short, disbelieving breath. You can't be serious. I am, I said. Robert looked from one window to the next. That's a significant ask. It's a clear one, I said. Melissa folded her hands. And if we decline, then you decline. I did not raise my voice. I did not fill the silence for them. That was part of it too. People say silence is passive because they're uncomfortable when it isn't. Robert looked down, then back up. We'll need to review this internally. Of course, I said. Dana's face had gone very still now. You're using a crisis to force terms. No, I said. I'm defining the terms under which I'm willing to participate. That landed harder because it was true. Nobody spoke after that. I glanced once at the clock on the microwave behind my screen. A plain digital readout. Plea numbers. I had promised myself not to let this conversation drift into argument, and it hadn't. Robert finally nodded. We'll be in touch. I'll look for it in writing, I said. Then I left the call. I closed the laptop, carried the mug to the sink, and stood there for a moment with both hands on the counter. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels earned. A few minutes later, my email chimed. They had already sent a follow-up message. Their follow-up email arrived less than 10 minutes after the call ended. I read it standing at the kitchen counter with one hand resting near the sink. The message came from Robert, with Dana and Melissa copied. The tone was more measured than before. They said they were reviewing my proposed terms and wanted a written outline of scope, availability, and payment requirements. That was the first time they had asked instead of assumed. I set the phone down and looked out the window over the sink. My father's backyard was still damp from a light shower earlier that morning. The grass had gone a little wild near the fence line, and one of the stepping stones by the shed had tilted sideways. Small things. Ordinary things. For a minute, that was where I kept my mind. Then I dried my hands, opened the laptop, and drafted a consulting agreement. I kept it plain. No inflated language. No clever pressure. Just terms. Hourly rate. Minimum block. Prepaid only. Support limited to interpretation of processes I had personally created or maintained. No guarantee of recovery for work they had failed to preserve. No after-hours emergency calls. No access to my personal files. No transfer of any independent materials. Advice and wattruffs only. At the bottom, I added one more line. Availability subject to funeral and estate obligations through the end of the week. I read that sentence twice before sending it. It said everything it needed to say. About an hour later, Melissa replied with minor wording changes. Most of them were expected. They wanted broader phrasing around operational continuity. They wanted a sentence clarifying that my participation did not alter my prior resignation. They wanted a line preserving each side's legal position. That part didn't bother me. People become more honest when lawyers start cleaning up the room. I revised the document, saved a copy, and sent it back. Then I closed the laptop and went to the funeral service. The chapel was modest, quiet, and a little too warm inside. There were fresh arrangements near the front, lilies and white roses, and the whole room carried that faint mix of flowers, old carpet, and polished wood. Men I remembered from childhood stood near the back in dark jackets with their hands folded in front of them. A few neighbors came in quietly and took seats without saying much. My father would have appreciated that. He never liked noise around serious things. I stayed near the front for most of the service. I shook hands. I nodded. I thanked people for coming. A former co-worker of my father's told me how he had once stayed late to fix classroom tables before a new semester because the maintenance backlog was too long and students needed the room ready by morning. Another man from the neighborhood said my father had helped him rebuild a shed door after a windstorm and refused any payment except a cup of coffee. I listened to all of it. What people remember, in the end, is rarely what you say about yourself. It's the small useful things you did when nobody was keeping score. After the burial, I walked back toward my car with dirt still fresh on my shoes and checked my phone for the first time in hours. 7 new emails. 3 from Robert, 2 from Melissa, 2 from Dana. I stood there in the cemetery parking area with the late afternoon wind moving across the grass and read them in order. Robert said finance was reviewing the consulting payment. Melissa had attached the revised agreement for signature. Dana asked whether I could make an exception and begin helping before funds cleared because the client review was now at risk. I read that one twice. Then I got in the car, closed the door, and let the silence settle around me. The interior still held a trace of cold from sitting outside. My tie felt tight. My hands were steady. This was the point where people usually make a mistake. They get pulled back into someone else's panic and start working before the rules are in place. They call it being reasonable. Later, they call it getting used. I had no interest in repeating that pattern, so I answered in order. To Melissa, I signed the agreement and returned it. To Robert, I said I would reserve time once payment confirmation was received. To Dana, I wrote only this. I'll begin when the signed agreement and prepaid retainer are both complete. Nothing more. I put the phone face down. Then I waited. That evening, back at the house, I changed clothes and went out to the garage. The overhead light cast a pale circle over the workbench. I found the unfinished walnut pendant again where I had left it, still resting near the folded rack. This time I picked up a sheet of fine sandpaper and started smoothing one rough edge. The motion helped. Steady pressure. Turn. Check the graying. Brush the dust away. After a while, my phone buzzed on the bench beside me. I ignored it for another minute, finished the edge I was working on, then looked. Payment confirmation. The retainer had been sent. I set the sandpaper down and opened the message from Robert. He said they wanted the first session the next morning at 9 a.m. He added that the Belmere team, engineering support, and department leadership would all attend. Not just a small troubleshooting call, then. They wanted a reconstruction. I wrote back with a 2-hour limit and asked them to submit their questions in advance. Within 20 minutes, a document arrived with bullet points, error summaries, report failures, missing workflow steps, and several process names that told me exactly how deep the problem had gone. They had not lost one reference point. They had lost the map. I printed the question list and spread it across the kitchen table. Some items were simple. Others told a fuller story. A delayed data sync they had likely blamed on the platform instead of their own settings. A report chain that only worked because I had built a manual checkpoint no one else seemed to understand. A fallback procedure that had probably been skipped because nobody knew why it existed in the first place. I made notes in the margin. Not long ones. Just enough. Check authentication sequence. Confirm timeout setting. Review handoff dependency. Ask who changed scheduled pull. At the top of the page, I wrote 3 short lines for myself. Step 1. Answer only the question being asked. Step 2. Don't rush to rescue what they failed to understand. Step 3. Let the structure teach them what the structure was doing. By the time I finished, the house had gone fully quiet. The kitchen light reflected softly on the tabletop. The clock above the stove read 11:18. I stacked the pages, rinsed my mug, and turned off the overhead light. The next morning, I was up before sunrise. I made coffee, put on a clean button-down, and set my laptop at the same place on the kitchen table. Outside, the sky was still a dull blue-gray, and the first light had just started touching the fence posts out back. The printed question list sat to my right. My notebook sat open to a blank page. At 8:57, a new email came in from Dana. No greeting, no condolence, just one sentence. Please be prepared to move quickly. I looked at it for a moment, then closed the message without replying. At exactly 9 o'clock, I clicked the meeting link. The call opened to a full grid of faces. Robert, Dana, Melissa, 2 engineers I recognized, 3 client-side people from the Belmere account, a project manager with a headset on, and a man I had never met who looked like he had been brought in recently because something had already gone wrong. No one made small talk. Robert spoke first. "Thank you for joining." I nodded once. "You have 2 hours. Let's start with the submitted list." Then I opened my notebook, took a breath, and waited for the first question. The first question came from one of the Belmere engineers. He was sitting in a conference room somewhere with a glass wall behind him and a legal pad open in front of him. He asked why one of the reporting chains had stopped populating overnight if the source tables were still updating on schedule. I looked down at my notes. "Because the reporting chain wasn't actually independent," I said. "It depended on a manual validation step before the pull was finalized. That step sat between the scheduled update and the published dashboard." There was a short pause. The engineer frowned. "We don't have that in the current process notes." "I know," I said. I kept my tone level. No edge, no performance, just facts. I shared my screen and pulled up a stripped-down process map I had recreated for the session. Not the old files, not private materials, just a clean visual showing sequence and dependencies. Box to box, decision point to decision point, timing markers, exception routes. It was enough to explain the system without handing over anything that wasn't covered by the agreement. I moved slowly through it. "This handoff here," I said, pointing to the second column, "was not decorative. It existed because the source table occasionally accepted incomplete records after large volume imports. The validation stopped those records from entering the client-facing report layer." One of the engineers shifted in his seat and looked off-screen, probably at someone sitting beside him. Robert leaned forward. "Are you saying the issue is operational rather than platform-based?" "I'm saying the platform behaved the way it usually behaves," I said. "The process around it was incomplete." No one argued with that. The next 40 minutes went the same way. Question, answer, pause, correction. I walked them through broken dependencies, undocumented checkpoints, and settings someone had likely changed without understanding why the defaults had been overridden in the first place. A timeout value, a fallback query, a sequence rule that only triggered under certain import conditions. Every time I answered, I kept it narrow and exact. At one point, Dana tried to cut across the explanation. "We don't need all the background," she said. "We just need to know how to fix it." I turned to her squarely on the screen and answered in the same voice I had used all morning. "The background is the fix." The call went quiet. Then I continued. "If you don't understand what the step is preventing, you'll remove it again in 2 weeks and end up in the same place." That was probably the first moment the room fully accepted the new shape of things. I wasn't there to absorb blame, soften consequences, or help them preserve appearances. I was there to define reality as it existed in the systems they had failed to understand. One of the Belmere people, a woman in a navy sweater with a headset around her neck, spoke next. Her voice was careful. "Were these gaps ever raised before now?" I had expected that question eventually. "Yes," I said. I clicked to another screen and pulled up a dated summary I had prepared. Not emotional, not accusatory, just a list of prior notices. Internal email subjects, meeting notes, requests for documentation time, escalation points, dates beside each one. December 11th, backup risk flagged. January 9th, training dependency noted. January 27th, report instability tied to skipped validation. February 14th, request for protected documentation time not approved. I let the list sit there for a second. Nobody said anything. Dana's face changed first. Not much, just a tightening around the mouth. Robert looked down at his desk. One of the engineers stopped typing altogether. The Belmere woman read the dates carefully, then said, "So the process risk was known." "I documented it more than once," I said. Robert jumped in then, trying to move the call forward. "What matters now is remediation." "Yes," I said, "and remediation starts with admitting what failed." Again, no raised voice. No accusation in the wording, just a statement that left very little room to hide. For the next half hour, I walked them through the corrections in order. First, restore the validation checkpoint before every major report pull. Second, separate live updates from client-facing publication until the exception queue is reviewed. Third, assign one owner to the handoff instead of 3 partial owners assuming someone else caught it. I said each step once, clearly, and waited while they wrote it down. Melissa from legal hadn't spoken at all during most of the session. But near the end, after one of the client-side managers asked whether these controls had ever been formalized by the company, she unmuted. To clarify, she said, today's session is advisory support under contract and should not be interpreted as an acknowledgement of prior ownership claims by either side. That was a lawyer's way of putting a fence around the room. I nodded. Understood. Then I went back to the process list. We finished with 11 minutes left in the 2-hour block. I looked at the clock in the corner of my screen, then back at the call. Robert said, "We appreciate the help." This was necessary. Necessary was an interesting choice. It carried more truth than gratitude. Dana spoke right after him. "We'll need you again Monday. There are still open items, and the client demo has to be rebuilt." I glanced down at my calendar notes before answering, even though I already knew the answer. "I'm not available Monday morning." Her expression sharpened. "This is time-sensitive." "I'm aware," I said. "I have an appointment with my father's estate attorney." For a second, nobody moved. It was as though they had all briefly forgotten why I was sitting in that kitchen and not in their office. Forgotten what had set the whole thing in motion. Forgotten that their deadlines were not the only reality in the room. Robert cleared his throat. "Could you make time later in the day?" "You can send written questions," I said. "I'll respond within the contracted window." Dana leaned forward. "That may not be enough." I met her eyes through the screen. "Then you'll need to decide what matters most." She opened her mouth, then stopped. What I had noticed about Dana over the years was that she did not like limits unless she was the one setting them. Rules were useful when they pinned down other people, less so when they held her in place. But the agreement was signed, the retainer was paid, and the scope was clear. She could be unhappy. That changed nothing. Robert tried a different approach. "We're trying to stabilize this in good faith." "I am too," I said. "That's why I'm here." The Belmere woman asked one last question, this time more softly. "Will your written summary include responsibility assignments?" "No," I said. "It will include process corrections. Responsibility is your internal matter." That seemed to settle something in the room. I wasn't there to humiliate anyone. I wasn't there to campaign for vindication. I was there to identify what was broken and what it would take to make it functional again. That difference mattered. At 10:59, I closed my notebook. "That's the end of today's session," I said. Robert nodded once. "Thank you." Dana did not say anything. I clicked leave meeting. The kitchen became quiet again, all at once. I sat there for a few seconds without moving. The coffee beside me had gone cold. Outside, a squirrel crossed the back fence and disappeared into the maple tree. Somewhere deeper in the house, the heater kicked on with a low metallic sound. Then my phone buzzed with a new email. It was from Belmere, not from my old company. The subject line was simple: "Follow-up documentation requested." I read the Belmere email twice before I answered. It had come from the client-side operations lead, the woman in the navy sweater from the call. Her message was polite and careful. She said the morning session had clarified several issues, and she wanted a written summary of the process corrections discussed, along with an outline of the control points that had been missed. What stood out to me was what the email did not ask for. She did not ask for the missing files. She did not ask for my old materials. She asked for a summary of what had just been explained in a paid advisory session. Clean, contained, appropriate. That told me Belmere had started separating facts from noise. I replied that any written summary would need to be routed through Robert as the contracting party, and I copied him on the response. I kept it short, then closed the laptop and left it closed for the rest of the morning. My appointment with the estate attorney was at 11:30. His office was on the second floor of a brick building near the courthouse, above a title company and next to an accountant's office with fading gold letters on the door. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly like old paper and coffee. There was a coat rack by the entrance, a bowl of wrapped mints on a side table, and one framed print of a horse farm on the wall. Nothing about it felt polished or modern. It felt steady, which was better. The attorney, Mr. Reeves, was in his 60s and spoke in a low, even way that made the room feel slower. He walked me through the estate inventory one item at a time. House, accounts, truck, tools, insurance, beneficiaries, transfer procedures, deadlines, signatures, witness lines, real things, measurable things. I signed where he pointed, asked the questions that needed asking, and made notes in the margin of my packet. By the time I walked back out to my car, the day had shifted. The sky had gone overcast, and the wind carried that dry late-season chill that makes you button your coat without thinking. When I checked my phone, I had 4 new emails. 2 from Robert, 1 from Dana, 1 from Melissa. Robert's first email said Belmere had requested an internal accountability review related to the migration delays. His second said finance had approved a second block of consulting hours if I was willing to continue through the end of the week. Dana's message was shorter. She asked whether I could be available for an urgent call at 3 o'clock. No greeting, no explanation. Melissa's message was the only one with real substance. She attached a redlined addendum extending the consulting scope by 8 hours and adding language for written summaries delivered after live sessions. I sat in the car and read all 4 in order again. There it was. First, the client asking questions. Then leadership trying to understand exposure. Then legal building structure around the answer. That is how truth usually comes out in organizations. Not as a confession, as paperwork. I drove back to the house, made coffee, and reviewed the addendum at the kitchen table. It was acceptable, clear enough, narrow enough. I signed it and sent it back with one note. Available today from 3 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern. Written questions preferred in advance. At 2:42, a document arrived. This one was different from the first list they had sent. It wasn't just technical questions anymore. It included a timeline request. Who had owned what? When certain risks had first been identified. When process gaps were reported. Whether training requests had been formally denied or simply not acted on. That told me Belmere was no longer asking how to fix the system. They were asking how the system had been allowed to drift that far without intervention. I pulled my records closer and built a clean chronology. December 11th, report instability noted after incomplete poll validation. January 9th, request submitted for formal training coverage during migration phase. January 27th, backup dependency flagged as unsupported. February 14th, request for dedicated documentation time deferred due to deadline pressure. March 3rd, follow-up warning sent on process concentration risk. Each date had a subject line. Each item had an attachment or a thread. I was careful not to overstate anything. If a request had been ignored, I did not call it ignored. I said no recorded action followed. If a note had been discussed in a meeting, I cited the meeting notes. Clean sequence. No decoration. At 3 o'clock, I joined the call. This time there were fewer people. Robert, Melissa, the Belmere operations lead, a man from Belmere Finance, 1 engineer. Dana joined 2 minutes late and looked like she had come in from another meeting already irritated. Robert spoke first. Thanks for making time. I nodded. Let's start with the timeline request. I shared the chronology and moved through it one date at a time. No speech, no accusation, just sequence. On December 11th, a risk in the validation process was documented after report inconsistency. On January 9th, I requested backup support and formal training allocation. On January 27th, I noted that certain process dependencies existed only in working practice, not approved documentation. On February 14th, I again requested protected time to close that gap. On March 3rd, I warned that too many critical functions sat with one person. When I reached the end, I stopped talking. The Belmere finance man adjusted his glasses and asked, "Were these issues known to department management at the time?" "Yes," I said. The messages were sent directly. He looked at the screen a second longer, and no documented mitigation followed. "Not that I have in the record," I said. Dana came in then. "That's not a fair characterization. We were operating under aggressive deadlines." I turned to her. "The dates are accurate," I said. Melissa looked down at her notes. Robert said nothing. Dana tried again, more tightly this time. "Context matters." "It does," I said. "That's why I included the sequence." The Belmere operations lead asked the next question without looking at Dana. Were the missing controls technical complexity, or were they management dependency? That was the clearest question anyone had asked so far. I answered it just as clearly. Both. The process had technical complexity, but the larger failure was concentration. Too much knowledge sat in one lane without approved backup, training, or formal adoption. Nobody interrupted. I continued. That is manageable when the environment is stable. It becomes a business risk when the organization assumes availability instead of planning for absence. That line sat in the call for a few seconds. Robert leaned back slightly and rubbed a hand along his jaw. Dana looked off screen. The engineer kept typing. Belmere Finance wrote something on paper by hand. Again, nobody argued, because there was nothing emotional to push against. Just structure. The rest of the call focused on remediation. Assign an actual process owner. Separate documentation from personality. Build backup coverage. Require sign-off when a control point is removed. Stop treating operational memory as a substitute for procedure. At one point, Belmere Finance asked whether I believed the system could be stabilized within 2 weeks. I considered that for a second before answering. Yes, I said, but only if the process is simplified, ownership is assigned clearly, and no one pretends the old model was sustainable. Robert's eyes dropped a little at that. When the session ended, Belmere thanked me directly. Robert thanked me too. Dana left the call before anyone else did. Afterward, I sent a written summary under the addendum terms. 3 pages. Process corrections, risk concentration findings, and a concise timeline appendix. No opinions. No blame language. Just documented sequence and recommendations. I sent it at 5:18 p.m. At 7:03 p.m., Robert emailed asking whether I had a few minutes for a private call. I said yes. He called instead of sending a link. His voice sounded different without an audience. Lower. More tired. I'm going to keep this brief, he said. Belmere has paused the current migration schedule pending internal review. They're not terminating yet, but they've escalated the account to executive oversight. I leaned back in the kitchen chair and listened. He continued. Finance is also reviewing our internal handling of the project. The timeline you provided is now part of that review. I said nothing. After a second, he added, You were right about the concentration risk. There was no pleasure in hearing that. Mostly just a kind of stillness. He exhaled. I should have acted sooner. That may be true, I said. He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, Dana has been removed from the Belmere account effective today. Engineering support and operations are being reassigned. We're restructuring oversight before the client makes a final decision. There it was. Not a dramatic collapse. Not some movie version of justice. Just reassignment, review, executive oversight, and a client deciding whether the damage was survivable. Real consequences almost always arrive in ordinary language. I understand, I said. Robert asked whether I would remain available through the contracted hours already approved. I told him yes, within scope, in writing, and around family obligations. He said that was fair. Before ending the call, he paused and said one more thing. I'm sorry about your father. This time it sounded like a person said it, not a manager. Thank you, I said. We ended the call. I set the phone down on the table and sat there for a while without moving. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator and the faint tapping of a branch against the back window. On the table beside me were estate papers, my father's old penknife, and the sanding cloth I had left there the night before after bringing in the walnut pendant from the garage. I picked up the pendant and turned it in my hand. The rough spots were nearly gone now. One edge still needed a little work near the top, but the shape had started to come through. A few minutes later, my email chimed again. This one was from Belmere Finance. The subject line read, Confirmation of receipt. I opened the email from Belmere Finance at the same kitchen table where I had taken every call that week. The message was brief. They confirmed receipt of the written summary and thanked me for the clarity of the timeline. They also said their executive team had decided to suspend the migration until a new control structure was put in place. Future communication, they wrote, would go through Robert and legal. That was all. No blame language. No apology. No unnecessary detail. Just a decision, written down in plain business terms. For me, that was enough. Once something is formalized, it stops drifting. It becomes real. I closed the laptop and left it closed. The next morning, I made tea instead of coffee. The house was quiet, and for the first time in several days, nothing urgent was waiting for me when I woke up. I stood at the counter while the kettle warmed and watched pale light move across the backyard. The grass looked uneven near the fence, and one of the flower beds needed to be cleaned out before spring really settled in. Small work. Good work. I carried the tea out to the garage and opened the side door to let in some fresh air. The place still smelled like cedar, old metal, and sawdust. My father's bench lamp was on, casting a soft circle of light over the work surface. I sat down, picked up the walnut pendant, and started sanding the last rough edge with a finer sheet than I had used before. Slow passes. Turn. Check the graying. Brush the dust away. No hurry. That was the part one noticed most after everything settled. I wasn't replaying the calls anymore. I wasn't trying to think of better lines or sharper answers. I had said what needed to be said, and the rest had moved through process, paper, and consequence the way things usually do when nobody interferes with the facts. A few days later, I drove back to my apartment. The city looked the same as always when I came in from the highway. Long ramps, warehouse walls, brake lights in clusters, the same stretch of office buildings catching late sun on their windows. But I didn't feel pulled toward any of it anymore. I stopped at a grocery store on the way home, bought eggs, bread, soup, and dish soap, then carried the bags upstairs two at a time. Inside, my apartment had that slightly stale, closed-up feel it gets when nobody has been there for days. I opened a window, changed the sheets, watered the plant by the sill, and put the groceries away. Then I cleaned the kitchen. Not deeply, just enough. I wiped the counters. I washed the mugs in the sink. I sorted the mail into a keep pile and a shred pile. Then I put the phone face down and let the room go quiet. That week, Robert used the rest of the contracted hours in short written exchanges. No more pressure. No more demands for exceptions. Just questions routed through the agreement and answered inside the scope. Process corrections. Control assignments. Clarifications on sequence. At the end of the final block, finance sent payment confirmation and a closing note. Professional. Contained. Complete. A week after that, I heard through a former colleague that Belmere had reduced the account and required a new oversight structure before expanding anything again. Dana had been moved out of operations entirely. Robert was still there, though in a narrower role. The company itself kept going, as companies do. Not because nothing happened, but because institutions rarely stop all at once. They just get smaller, slower, and more careful after the bill comes due. I didn't feel victorious hearing any of that. Mostly, I felt finished. About a month later, I accepted a role with a smaller firm outside Louisville. Fewer layers, fewer meetings, 10 people total. During my second conversation with them, the owner asked how I was holding up after losing my father. Not as an opening to get me to work sooner. Not as a courtesy line before discussing salary. Just as a real question. I noticed the difference immediately. They gave me time to onboard properly. They wanted my process notes documented in shared folders from the start. They assigned backup coverage before I even asked. The first week, someone from operations told me, if only one person knows how something works, then we don't actually own the process. It was such a plain sentence, but I remember sitting there thinking how many problems could be prevented if more places understood something that simple. At home, I settled into a routine again. Laundry on Sundays, groceries on Tuesday evenings, tea after dinner if I was working late. Every now and then I'd take the walnut pendant off the shelf and run my thumb over the grain. Once I finally drilled the top and threaded a cord through it, I set it beside my keys in a small ceramic dish near the door. Not as a symbol exactly, just as something finished with care. 6 months later, I got a message from Robert on LinkedIn. He said he had handled things badly. He said he had been trying to fix the way he managed people. He also said he had thought about my father often since hearing how many people came to the service and what they said about him. I read the message once, then again. There are times when silence is the right boundary, and there are times when one plain sentence does the job. This felt like the second kind. So I wrote back, he was a good man. I appreciate you saying that. Then I closed the app and went back to what I was doing. That evening, I made dinner, washed the pan, and wiped down the stove. Afterward, I took a short walk around the block. The air was cool, and somebody nearby had a grill going, so the whole street smelled faintly like charcoal and cut grass. Porch lights were coming on one by one. A dog barked from behind a fence and then quieted down. When I got home, I hung my keys up, set the pendant back in the dish, and stood in the kitchen for a moment with the lights low. That was the real ending for me. Not the calls, not the agreement, not the client review. Just a quiet room, clean counters, steady work, and no need to explain myself anymore. Every now and then, someone still tells me a story about being cornered at work during the worst week of their life. A denied leave request. A manager who mistakes dependence for loyalty. A process held together by one tired person nobody notices until they step away. It happens more than people think. And when it does, the first useful thing is usually the same. Slow down, write things down, and let the facts keep their shape. If this story stayed with you, I'd appreciate it if you'd like the video and subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I always like seeing where people are listening from. 2 popular stories will be waiting for you next.